Hello and welcome back to my channel. It is a very sunny day today, thank goodness, because it's been grey for the last month or so, but I have to be careful to not go like this too much. Anyway, it is time to do my favorite books of 2024. Before we get into the actual video, I wanted to address the fact there's not been a lot of videos lately. No worries, everything is fine. I've just not been in the mood to film every week, and I feel like I wanted to find something that is more sustainable for me. I've been keeping up with monthly reading videos, and I think at least for now that's what I'll continue to do, because I feel like a video a month is more my kind of pace. Maybe I'll do something here extra here and there if I feel like it. But I am planning to do more live sprints, reading sprints this year, and my plan is to have those on a more regular schedule. Right now my aim is to have them every other Friday in the afternoon my time. So I've done a few in the end of last year, and they've always been a lot of fun and a great way of connecting with you guys. So yeah, it would be lovely to see you there if you want to have some sort of simultaneous reading time. I'm not sure when I'll put out this video, but I'll make sure I'll put the date of the next reading sprint in the description box. Okay, now let's get into the actual meat of the video. This year I made an actual top 10, and I also ranked them. Who even is she? So we're gonna go from number 10 to my number 1 favorite book of 2024. A few little caveats before we continue. These are my best books of 2024, not the best books of 2024, meaning that I weigh my personal enjoyment of these books heavier than any sort of objective quality. Of course, I think all these books are quality, but I'm not a professional book reviewer, so I can only go off my own opinion and experience. And then secondly, these are all books I read in 2024, not published in 2024. None of these were published in 2024. I'm very much a backlist reader. I think half of these weren't even published in the 21st century. So yeah, having said that, let's go to my my number 10 book. And this was actually the choice that was hardest for me to make, because a choice between like number 7 and 8 or number 4 and 5 is not so important. But you know, the number 10 spot, that's the last spot a book might lose out not being in this video altogether. And there were a couple of contenders that nearly made it, but in the end I ended up going for Femina, A New History of the Middle Ages Through the Women Written Out of It by Janina Ramirez, just because this really rekindled my enthusiasm for history and just learning things in general. I'm an air sign and I really thrive on gathering knowledge and insights. So yeah, obviously this is a non-fiction book, the first out of 2 on this list, and in this book Ramirez takes you along 9 different objects from the Middle Ages found at archaeological digs, museums, churches, libraries, and what these objects teach us about the women who owned them, who these women were, what made them both remarkable and at the same time a lot like other women at that time. It is the kind of book that often challenges what you've learned in your history lessons in school. I think the author's aim with this book was maybe not necessarily tell us about these specific women. I think she could have chosen 9 other women and it would essentially still be the same book. It's a book that challenges the way we look at history, and it teaches us to be critical towards our sources and where we get our information from. History is a narrative, and you need to be aware of who decides what the narrative is. And I love that you can apply that to medieval women but then also to any of the current events in the world. I love learning how history is not something set in stone, but rather an ever evolving thing. I think my only critical note of this book would be that it is very Western and very white, but to me that also only shows me that there's so much more to be relearned. So yeah, that was number 10. And number 9 we have This Beauty, Now in November by Josephine Johnson. This is the Dutch translation. I really love this book as an object. I really love the colors in the cover. It has these beautiful colored end pages. So this is Johnson's debut novel. It was published in 1934 when she was only 24 years old. And this is one of those very slow-paced, reflective, not much happens in the story most of the time kind of book. A real quiet gem. It's set in the Depression era, and Arnold Hartman, he has just lost his job, and he decides to take his family, his wife and his 3 children, out to the Midwest, where he has inherited a farm. But instead of kind of the salvation he thought it would bring, an opportunity to be self-providing and live off the land, it turns out to be just really hard labor, back-breaking work, and you really feel this ever oppressive worry that it will never be enough. There's always the threat of the bank, who can at any moment confiscate their house if they don't manage to pay the rent in time. There's the drought, the Dust Bowl that literally sucks everything dry, including all sense of hope. And yet this family keeps on going because they have to. I think the writing on a sentence by sentence level is really beautiful. There's a lot of nature writing in this. The landscape is almost like a character of its own in this book. I think the story is very much about nature taking its own course. The land will always do its own thing, no matter how much we try to change it. It's about our relationship with the land, how much we depend upon it, and how fragile this bond is. And you just follow this family and how each member deals in their own individual way with the hardships that they are dealt. I think this book is both a time capsule of a very specific time and place, but also very much a timeless book that I think I can read over and over again. And number 8 we have The Postcard by Anne Berest. This is a Second World War historical novel based on the author's own family. It's a novel, but it's a book that really borders fiction and non-fiction. The author receives a postcard from 2003, and on that postcard are only written 4 names, the names of her 4 grandparents, who were all deported and then killed at Auschwitz. The card wasn't signed, there was no return address, it just had these 4 names. So the author decides to delve into her family history, and this book is like a fictionalized account of her family's history, and then also the author's journey in learning about her family. What I really liked about this book, or rather appreciated about this book, is that we don't follow the family members who go to Auschwitz, but we are with the family members who survive, who manage to stay hidden, and so this book really shows survivor's guilt, that feeling of constantly being on guard, of being distrustful, of not understanding why you are still there when most of your family is not, and how that trauma is passed on to new generations. It really showed a side of the Holocaust I wasn't familiar with. A big theme of this book is memory and remembering, and how trauma can both distort someone's personal idea of themselves and also the collective memory of a group. This was such a compelling book too. I read this pretty much in one sitting, and it's quite a hefty book. You know, granted, I was on a train journey of about 8 hours with not much else to do, but still, there's not many books that keep me engaged for so long. It essentially reads like a mystery, but it also intersects, you know, big grand scale history and intimate personal stories, which I found really well done. Yeah, I don't think this is a book I will quickly forget. At number 7 we have another translated book. The Postcard was translated from the French, and at number 7 we have A Little Luck by Claudia Pineiro. A few years ago Elena Knows was in my favorite books of the year, and in 2024 I was once again in awe of Pineiro's writing. She's one of those authors where you read the first few pages of the book and you just know you're going to be in good hands. Like the first chapter in this book, or the prologue, I don't know what you want to call it. It's only a paragraph, but that's just a masterpiece in its own right. It's about a woman who grew up in Argentina, and something has happened in her past that made her leave everything behind, change her identity and move away to the United States, like completely start a new life. And in the book she has to go back to Argentina for work, and she gets confronted with the past that she tried to get away from. And slowly throughout the book it is revealed what happened to her and what it's like for her to come back to Argentina. And I think Claudia Pineiro is just so good at building tension, feeding you tiny crumbs of information throughout the book. It's not like a fast-paced potty book with a lot of twists and turns, but yeah, the way the arc is built in this book is really, really good. Yeah, I love the writing style. I love the complexity of the characters. The characters are so layered, and the way Pineiro writes about the subtleties of the human psychology, the way she lets her characters struggle with complex emotions like guilt and regrets, that is so intricately done. Again, I was really impressed with her writing. Number 6 is Our Missing Hearts by Celeste Ng. Now, I was a little bit surprised by this one, because her previous books, Everything I've Never Told You and Little Fires Everywhere, were both very popular on BookTube when they came out, but I feel like this one kind of flew under the radar. So I was a little worried that maybe it wasn't that good, but I ended up really loving this book. It's about a 12-year-old boy named Noah. He calls himself Bert. He lives together with his father, who's a teacher, in a small apartment, and you know, they always kind of keep to themselves, and Bert is always told to keep a low profile and not to draw any attention on himself. And one day Bert gets a postcard from his mother. She had left the family when he was about 6 years old, and Bert doesn't really know why. His dad never talks about her, and whenever he hears his dad talk to other people about his mother, it almost seems like he's glad that she's left. But Bert gets kind of intrigued, and the first part of this book ends up being almost like a quest where he goes to find his mother. And early in the book you start to realize that there's something a bit off about the world that Bert lives in. In the beginning it really feels like a contemporary story until you start noticing small things that are just a little bit strange. And it becomes clear that this is not a contemporary book, but a very near future dystopian. It's set about 10 years after a big economic crisis. There's a lot of prejudice and racism against Asian people in particular, and Bert, during his quest to find his mother, learns how people are silenced, and he learns about protest, and especially art as protest. I really enjoyed this. I think Celeste Ng writes beautifully. I love her word choice. I love how she constructs a sentence. It's not overwrought or overly flowery, but there is a beauty and an emotional weight to her language. I was really impressed with how she creates a world that is so frighteningly close to our current society. She has taken elements of the world we live in today and just has taken them slightly further. Like the increase in anti-Asian racism during the pandemic, how removing children from their families can be seen as a political strategy. Think about indigenous people who were forced to go to residential school, and more recently immigrant families who get separated at the border. It's a book that shows you what could happen if we're not careful. In the end, I think it's a really hopeful book. There's a strong sense of fighting for what's right in this book and for working together to a common goal. The strength of stories and poetry and how art can inspire people is also an important aspect, and I love how the librarians are the unsung heroes of this book. It's not a perfect book. I think especially the pacing is not always very even, but I really enjoyed this book, and I think it's definitely a book that will give you a lot to think about. Number 5 is the next and last non-fiction book on this list, and that is Travels with Charley by John Steinbeck. I don't have a physical copy of this because I actually read this while traveling, and it got a little bit too beaten up and it fell apart. But yeah, it's Steinbeck. I have yet to read a book by him that I didn't love, and I also loved this one very much. This is essentially a travelogue or a travel memoir. Steinbeck wrote this in the early 1960s. He was at that point at the end of his career. He had already written his most famous novels, and he'd been living in New York for about 20 years at that time, and he really wanted to travel the country again one more time and basically meet the people that he'd been writing about. Everyday common people, and just get reconnected with the land. He converts a camper van and then he just sets out on the road with his poodle Charley. And then he does in this book what Steinbeck does best, and that is writing about the landscape and the people he meets and about what makes people tick in different parts of the country. I love how Steinbeck can take the most mundane situations, the most ordinary everyday happenings, and turn them into these really fascinating anecdotes. He's a writer who can find a story anywhere, and I love how he made this very unique time capsule with this book, capturing the opinions and ideas that everyday people had at that time, what was important to them. And yeah, his writing is so good, on a sentence by sentence level as well. Not a word is out of place. I think if you've loved Steinbeck's fiction work, you'll love this book. If you love traveling, you love this book. Yeah, I'm definitely gonna get myself another copy of this book because I think it's a real treasure. Number 4, is that right? Yeah, number 4 is The Women of Brewster Place by Gloria Naylor. This is a collection of interlinked short stories. It's set in Brewster Place, which is kind of a rundown apartment block in an unnamed city somewhere in America. It is kind of forgotten and dilapidated, and the people who live there, they don't live there by choice. They either couldn't afford to live anywhere else, or they weren't welcome in other places. And every story centers around one of the women living on Brewster Place. I think there's 7 or 8 stories in all, and you can read them all as separate stories, but they are all set in the same place, and people from one story will come into the other, and they sort of connect that way. These women did and still don't have easy lives. There's a lot of tragic and terrible things happening, and I should warn you that there's quite a few content warnings for this, but what I found so impressive about this book is that Gloria Naylor finds a way to blend the deeply sad and heart-wrenching with the hopeful and the light and joyous and funny. This book has a great sense of humor, some very sharp dialogue, but I could go from laughing to crying to laughing again within a few pages. There's a real sense of sisterhood and resilience in these stories, other than living on the same street. These women don't actually have a lot to do with each other, but they all have a shared wish to belong and to find reprieve from their grief and their struggle in their lives. And even though they've all experienced some terrible things, they still have this generosity to them, and a way to stay soft and vulnerable. Yeah, I think all the characters are very well portrayed, very complex, very layered, women who have lived full lives, and I think that really comes across on the page, even though you don't actually spend that much time with each of them. Yeah, I really love this. It's one of those books that had been on my want to read list for years and years, so I'm very glad I finally got to it. And now we are getting into the top 3, so that's the podium places. At number 3 we've got The House of Mirth by Edith Wharton. This is the story of Lily Bart, and she's a woman in her late 20s, and she lives her life among the social elite of New York at the turn of the 20th century. And everyone loves Lily Bart. She's considered very beautiful. She's someone who's always at the center of attention and the life of the party, and people are just naturally drawn to her. She's someone who grew up very rich, but when both of her parents died, it turns out there was quite a lot of debt, so she doesn't have any money of her own. She gets an allowance from her aunt, but she's desperate to find a husband who will provide for her, so she can keep up with this rather glamorous lifestyle that she's used to. But she also wants romance and love, and she doesn't want to compromise just for money. And what I loved about this book is that on first glance it's very much a book about rich people. It really shines a light on a very specific small layer of society in a certain moment in time that doesn't really have anything to do with the majority of people. It really reads like a soap opera of rich people problems, and you know, it's filled with drama. But I think also that Lily Bart is one of the most fascinating characters in literature. She goes through this book trying to keep up appearances. She deals with men who will take advantage of her when she's at her most vulnerable. She's a very frustrating character. She's arrogant, she's entitled, she makes stupid decisions because she thinks she's untouchable, but yet she doesn't have that ruthlessness to really make it in the social elite. She has a touch of innocence and kindness in her that will lead to her downfall, and that really makes her a very tragic heroine. For some reason, I just did not expect her to be such a complex character. I read this whilst also listening to the audiobook at the same time, and that definitely added to my enjoyment. It was a real immersive experience, and I was really transformed to another world for a while, and yeah, I think this is definitely a new favorite classic. At number 2, my runner-up, we have Split Tooth by Tanya Tagaq. This book just had me completely spellbound. It was so good. It's about a teenage Inuit girl growing up in the 1970s in Nunavut, Canada, which is like in the Arctic tundra. And she has a lot of dark things happening in her life. This book comes with a lot of content warnings. She witnesses violence and alcohol abuse in her family. She suffers sexual abuse from a teacher. She also witnesses her peers getting abused. She turns to various substances. There's bullying and cruelty from her classmates. The colonialism and the ongoing influence on the Inuit people plays a big role, and it's just generally a lot. There's also a lot of descriptions of the physical environment she's living in, and just life in the Arctic, the danger of living in such a cold, harsh place, very unforgiving nature, what it's like during the polar day when it's light all around the clock and the groups of kids basically run wild, how to deal with potential dangerous wildlife like polar bears and feral foxes. There's a real strong sense of place in this book, and the further you get into the book, the more the lines between reality and the more mythical and folklore parts start to blur. Our protagonist has a way of communicating with the spirit world, basically through nature, so through animals, but also with the northern lights and the wind, and she sometimes loses herself in that world, and you're not always sure what's real and what's not. And I think the way to read this is not to try and understand it, but just let the story take you. All these dark things that are happening in this young woman's life move into this magical, mythical, fierce and raw energy. I think the writing in this is beautiful. It's very lyrical and poetic. It actually mixes more forward. It actually mixes more straightforward prose with poems or maybe song lyrics. The author is a musical artist as well, and I think that really shines through in this book. I think it's hard to convey what this book is doing. It really defies genres, and I don't think this is going to be for everyone. You know, if you try this and you don't like it, then yeah, I get it. But I think if you do find a connection with this book, you will love it on another level. It's a book that I won't forget anytime soon, and it's just something that really will grab onto you and hold on fast. And then my number one book of 2024 is We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. This book was first published in 1962, so over 60 years ago, but unsurprisingly this book still finds new readers all the time. We follow this young woman named Mary Catherine Blackwood, or Mary Cat, and she lives with her older sister Constance and their uncle Julian in this big secluded mansion. They are ostracized by their local community because of a tragedy that happened a few years earlier when most of her family was poisoned and they died. Constance was actually accused of this, but she was later acquitted of the crime. But the community, however, still looks upon them with sort of equal parts fascination and fear. So the Blackwoods, they keep to themselves, and they are quite content living this way until their cousin Charles shows up and shakes things up. It's a book with great atmosphere. You have this dark, eerie mansion. The characters all have their own weird characteristics and, you know, odd things that they do, and it just has this really deliciously unsettling vibe to it, which I love. Everything is just slightly off. Mary Cat is also not a very reliable narrator, so you're never quite sure what to think. And this is one of those books that's only small. It's around 150 pages, but there is so much to explore in this book. It's a book that centers around the concept of fear, I think. You have the fear from the villagers that leads to hostility and violence, especially when acting as a group, as a mob. But also Constance and Mary Cat have their very own way of taking care of each other that involves a lot of small rituals and superstition, and the fear around that when things outside of their control start to happen. The amount of character development and psychological depth that they have, the complex family relationship that is in these pages. To have all that in this small little book, I think is astounding. It is so well written, it is frightening and tense, and it really delves deep into the human psyche. I think this is a book that I can read over and over and over again and just find more and more layers to it. Even thinking about it now, there is so many things I could tell you about this book, and yeah, why I find it so amazing. So yeah, this was a very easy #1 book for me this year. So yeah, that was it. My top 10 books of 2024. Let me grab the stack. There we have it. Having all these books together makes me very, very happy. I'm just very excited to also find new favorites for 2023. 2025. I hope you enjoyed this video, and maybe you've also added some books to your TBR. I'd love to know your thoughts on this list. Please leave any comments, thoughts, ideas you have about these books down below, and I will see you in my next video. Bye bye.